The reading that Dory began today are instructions from God to Moses and to Aaron to be relayed to the people of Israel. These are the instructions for the First Communion, in which they take the lamb, and then God describes what happens after that. So as we get started this morning, I want you to kind of, if you can, forget for a moment everything that's happened in the past week. Try to set aside everything that's on your mind this morning, your to-do lists and your shopping list and football. Set aside last Thursday's game, if you can. I want you to take a deep breath and go on a short journey of imagination. I want you to try to put yourself in the place of a Hebrew slave in Egypt some 3,500 years ago. Your people, the people known as Hebrews, have been enslaved in Egypt for more generations than you can count. Hundreds of years. Your ancestors, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they're just kind of barely remembered, almost mythical people to you. Stories about them are told over the table and around the campfires and just by oral tradition, but you barely remember. And the God that they worshipped is this God that doesn't have a name, nobody has ever seen. He too is just a distant memory because you're surrounded by idols. You're submerged in this alien culture, this Egyptian culture. You almost don't remember what this God was like. Now Moses comes along. Moses, this guy you don't know, this guy who there's rumors about what he's done, about how he used to be somebody, and then he committed a murder and he fled, and now he's come back all these years later. And this guy, he's engaged for some reason in a battle with Pharaoh. He's come on a mission from God, he says. And he's waging this conflict with Pharaoh to try to free the Hebrew people. And you don't remember asking him to do that. You don't remember asking anybody to come in and fight for your freedom, because what good is freedom without a home? And what good is freedom if you don't have a way to eat? And you can't imagine what it's like not to have those things, not to be told what to do. You no longer remember what it's like not to be a slave. And Moses just keeps escalating the conflict. He proclaims that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob sent him, this God with no name, and he just keeps ratcheting up the conflict with Pharaoh. And there have been 9 plagues already, 9 miserable plagues. And instead of setting you free, things have gotten worse for you. And now Moses and Aaron tell you that there's another plague coming, the 10th plague. And he's telling you that to prepare for it, you're going to have to do something kind of weird. Moses is telling you that God is telling you to do these things. First of all, as you heard, you have to choose a lamb. And you choose a lamb on the 10th day of the month. And you set it aside for 4 days. And this can't be just any lamb or any goat. It has to be a year old, and it has to be perfect. So it's valuable. And then Moses says you have to sacrifice this lamb. That's not weird in itself. Animal sacrifice is something that's part of your culture. Egyptians practiced it. They practiced it back in the land where the Hebrews came from. It's just normal in the Mediterranean basin. That in itself is not weird, but then what you're asked to do when you sacrifice the lamb, what you do by cutting its throat, you're asked to catch the blood in a bowl or in a basin. You catch the life force as it drains out of this animal. And then, and this is where it gets strange, you use this blood to mark the posts and the lintel of your own house, your own hut where you live with your family. That does seem odd. It seems really, really strange, but Moses just seems so sure of himself when he relays this message. And after all, if Moses is right, and he's not just crazy, then he's relaying this message from God. And you remember that God is in the back of your head. And so, because of that, you listen. And you do what Moses and God told you to do. You take the blood that you caught, and you go to your house. And you mark it. You mark the lintel. You mark the frame, the post, with the blood of this lamb. And as you're doing this, maybe feeling a little sheepish, no pun intended. You look at your neighbors on either side of you, and they're doing the same thing. And all of a sudden you realize that this thing that seems kind of strange, and you're all doing it, and all of the Hebrew families are doing this, they're marking their doors this way. This is an act of defiance. This is an act of standing up to Pharaoh. And you start to wonder, are you doing the right thing? For us, looking back, some 3,000 or 3,500 years, we have to wonder, what was the point of doing this? Now, Exodus tells us that God said the markings were so that they would be a sign that Hebrews lived in this house, and it would be a sign that God would pass over that house. Well, he was delivering the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn in Egypt. And that's pretty neat. It's pretty dramatic. But when you think about it, does God really need a guide like this? We think of God, the God we know is omniscient and omnipotent. And we have to wonder, does God really need, a forward air controller telling him, okay, you hit this house, you don't hit this one has a sign. You go to the ones that don't have that. It seemed like God would know which houses to hit. So maybe it's not literally a sign that says, don't kill anybody here, but it's something else. And I think that maybe at least, this was really a way to make the Hebrew people, or the Hebrew slaves, choose to stand up for themselves. Maybe it was a way for them to choose freedom by doing something that set them apart from their Egyptian masters and set them apart from everybody else in that society. To say, we are Hebrews. We are a people. And we want our freedom. Up to this point, the Hebrews had been very passive in the struggle for their freedom. They had been bystanders, just sort of getting crunched a little more with each plague. Maybe this was a way to show them the importance of having an identity. Maybe this was a way of showing them how important it was to say, yes, I am a descendant of Abraham and Isaac. I am a child of Israel. Maybe it was a way to get them to assert their identity, to say, okay, we're proud of who we are. We don't care how powerful you are, Pharaoh. We're going to mark our houses so you know exactly where we are. Maybe it was a way for them to find strength again. Not the physical strength that they need to stand up to back-breaking labor, because they've been doing that for generations and they have that. But it was a strength of character. It was moral strength. To say, this is what my God has called me to do. This is what our God has called us to do. This is what my people, brothers and sisters, are doing in response to what God has called us to do. So it's far more than just a sign to say, pass over this house. It's a sign to say, we believe. We are standing up. It is time for us to become who we were meant to be. So this was the start of the journey. After generation upon generation upon generation of captivity, Hebrew people had sort of forgotten who they were. They'd kind of forgotten what it meant to be a people standing on their own. And gradually now, from this point on, they would relearn it. They would learn about their God. They would learn what their God expected of them. They would learn about faith, and they would learn about trust in each other and in God. And this journey was going to take decades. They didn't know it then. We know it because we can look back. But it would take decades before they were ready to enter the promised land as the people of Israel. But it was only this way, by reclaiming their heritage and strength, with this first step in the journey, that they could properly become, again, the vehicle for the covenant that God had made with their ancestors. It was only by doing this that they would be able to maintain a culture and a history that would stand up to conflict for the next couple of 1,000 years. Conflicts that still go on today. It was only this way that they'd be able to maintain a culture that would be able to carry the promise of the Savior, that would be passed faithfully from generation to generation for the next 1,300 years until the birth of Christ. And all of that started at a doorway like that. A doorway that would take them from captivity and enslavement to the glory of being God's chosen people because they made a choice. Passover and the death of the firstborn is a thing of wonder and terror, really. But as we look back, we wonder, is that only ancient history now? Do these things have any application in our world today? What does something like this act of faith and defiance, what meaning could it have today? These are difficult times. Christians around the world these days are dying. Christians around the world still exist in captivity of one sort or another, every bit as grinding as it was in Egypt. A Christian living in northern Iraq, or a Christian living in Iran or China or Southeast Asia knows what it's like to be oppressed. Too many of them know what it's like to sacrifice their lives. We have it good here. We have to ask ourselves, if we were Christians in those circumstances, would we have the courage to identify ourselves? Or would we prefer keeping our head down and practicing our faith clandestinely? Because, discretion is the better part of valor sometimes. But this story, a simple act, reminds us how important it is to define ourselves when we're in danger of being submerged into society and lost. It's a reminder that this is not a time to live passively with everything that's wrong in the world. It is time to claim or to reclaim the name of Christian in a world that is increasingly ambivalent, if not hostile. But if we're going to do that, we have to know who we are. What does it mean to be a Christian? If we're going to stand apart, we need to know why we need to stand apart. And more importantly, we need to know how. Is it just wearing a cross? Is that Martha's? Putting a fish on our car? Is it coming to church? What is it? And it turns out that John Wesley actually answered those questions for us a couple of hundred years ago. And we're going to take a look at Wesley's answers next week. But until then, I invite you to exercise your imagination a little bit one more time and forget that you know the end of the story. Forget that you know about the parting of the Red Sea and the journey to Mount Sinai and wandering in the wilderness and Edward G. Robinson getting swallowed up by the earth. Forget you know all that and consider the plight of our spiritual ancestors 3,500 years ago. In the middle of this conflict with God just being a vague memory and this crazy guy Moses engaged in a death struggle with Pharaoh, the most powerful man in that part of the world, ask yourself honestly, would I have the courage to do something like that? And to say to the world, I stand against Pharaoh. I stand with my God. Because you couldn't have known back then what was going to happen. The only thing you could know for sure is that these dabs of blood were going to change your life forever. Amen.